Alright, I've got a few notey ones which I'm going to get rid of and do. They're all pretty kind of concise and don't really get their point across too well. But after that, I had this idea in debating with my sister about whether ethical egoism is correct, and I am fairly adamant that it is, although I think, as I said before, this Max Stirner guy, or maybe I didn't say it, maybe it was one of the things I've written and I'm going to read, but even the egoists I don't agree with. I think they're all fucking wrong. The people who are strong proponents of ethical egoism, their ideas are pretty wrong, I reckon. So maybe I need a better word. I was thinking of maybe something like, well, Darren Brown keeps going on about the considered life in this happy book, which is quite a few things that let me down in that. I'm finding some inconsistencies. So maybe it would be considered egoism, or I was thinking considerate egoism is probably more likely, because you're, one, being considerate of other people, because that would be better for you. But it's more, you're also considerate of the fact that your self-interest is dependent and contingent upon the self-interest of others. So maybe considered, considerate, or what was the other? Informed. I was thinking informed egoism is probably better. Might be a good one. Just something that captures the fact that you're taking everything into consideration, rather than just thinking, what is the most hedonistic act for me to do right this second, which would almost certainly be something like crystal meth. And even some egoists, I think, take the long term into consideration, so they might think, maybe, so it would be more, well, it's obviously not this, but it would be the equivalent of doing lower doses of crystal meth across time, try and maximise the actual area of the curve, but not actually considering the possibilities of having meaningful relationships and things like that. Right. So I'm going to read these, and then I'm going to pause it, start another one, and do this little idea I had for there was this, I looked up egoism to see what the counter-arguments were. There's very little about it. I guess people just shrug it off as maybe because the proponents were so bad at or failed to understand well, anyway. There was some kind of article that tackled all three types of egoism, so psychological, ethical and rational, and I was going to try and debate it, if you will. Why ethical egoism recommends behaving as altruistically, charitably, and as part of a cohesive society as possible. Once you realise that next time it could be you, in the case of the Jews in Auschwitz, for example, you see why you can't allow it to be anyone else ever. So that's a pretty poor, not a very good one. Ethical egoism would in fact recommend the opposite of self-centeredness. The possible benefits of the gestalt of society will always outweigh the possibilities available to someone going solo. In fact, ethical egoism underpins any and every moral theory, or why else would anyone adhere to it? Adhere to any moral theory, I mean. It may be best to apply the logic of something like utilitarianism for application's sake, but only because of how that is most likely to work out in your self-interest. Say you disagree, and you think ethical egoism is not a solid ground for morality. What moral structure do you replace it with? Okay, and why? Once your moral theory has been defined, should any individual adhere to the tenets of that moral theory? I suggest that it's because it's in their self-interest to do so, and in fact they only would follow it if they believed it was likely in their self-interest to do so. And I propose that they only should if it is in fact in their self-interest to do so. You might say, well, no, because they're doing it out of fear. Well, that would be something that's in their self-interest. If they're fearful of something that might happen if they don't follow the thingy, then it's obviously in their self-interest because they're trying to avoid the thing that they don't want to happen. Furthermore, I doubt it's hard to see how it's in your self-interest to convince others to follow your moral what you believe to be the correct moral theory. So, ethical egoism is worse than I thought. Even those who claim to be ethical egoists are completely wrong about it. All it is a game theory problem. A vast and complex one, yes, but a game theory problem nonetheless. You are trying to act, and should be trying to act, in what is actually in your self-interest. We know that there will be patterns to behaviours that are more or less likely to propel you towards that aim. This may mean that it is best for you to adopt some simplified theory, which should always be contained within egoism and is in accordance with its aims. such as utilitarianism, because adhering to this is what is most likely to result in maximising your well-being. It's very unlikely that you will be a perfect assessor of what is going to be in your self-interest in every scenario, and so it would be in your best interest to acknowledge this and do what you can to counter it by drawing what information you can from the experiences and predictions of others, and then forming condensed little rules that you can apply to broader scenario, to its what's it called? I talked about similar to how I talked about. Can't remember what the actual example was, but our emotional responses, our visceral emotional responses, being like shorthand for the long cognitive process that would think. So that's what you're effectively doing with other moral theories that will always be tried and tested human male. Oh no, that's stupid. Just stupid, that is. I thought of another bit to go in my non-existent Sherlock comedy series. Moriarty, who was the supposed protagonist. Moriarty, who the supposed protagonist Sherlock makes out to be the supposed antagonist. In reality, he's not. Sherlock is behind all the actual murders. Moriarty is desperate to kill himself, but every attempt is thwarted by Sherlock to the perplexity. God, I'm not very good with P's. Double P noise. Well, not double P, but closely proximal P's. To the perplexity of everyone around him, including Moriarty. Watson asks him if he's thwarted by Sherlock to the perplexity of everyone around him, including Moriarty. Watson asks him if he's so evil, why not just let him kill himself? And Sherlock delivers a smouldering speech about how if we let him kill himself, where does it stop, John? Maybe at first it's just himself he kills, but what's to stop him from killing again and again in increasingly more gruesome and violent ways? Never once stopping to consider the hopes and dreams of all he kills, just riding the climactic wave of erotic glory as he murders successively more beautiful victims, basking in the glory of their dying wishes and seeing their constitutions crumble under the force of his powerful will. And he's obviously clearly describing his own murderous motivations. So, just a little... I don't know why I thought of that. I haven't thought about it for a long time, but it just came to me. But I was thinking about killing myself. The perfect paedophile ethical egoism counterexample. So, when I was arguing with my sister about it, she kept bringing up the point of what if Hitler, it turns out, was acting perfectly in his self-interest, and therefore who's to say? She then somehow concludes that who's to say he was wrong, and I keep telling her that we're all to say she's wrong. You are to say it's always you. He's probably the only one who's going to consider himself not to be good and to be right and not to be wrong, and it's in your self-interest to convince him otherwise. But anyway, I came up with a better example myself than the Hitler one. And obviously, the other thing I keep going on about is never mind. The perfect paedophile ethical egoism counterexample. So imagine a person who believes truly that it's in their self-interest to have a child, and then like these people sometimes do, and probably do more often than we think, and then they just trap it in some kind of basement and use it for sexual pleasure or something like that, right? And they're convinced that they can get away with it as well, right? So surely it's in their self-interest to do so. Well, maybe. It's still wrong from everyone's perspective but his or her own, well, the paedophile. It's certainly in our self-interest to do whatever we can to convince them that it won't be in their self-interest because of how we shall treat them. So, yeah, I guess it's probably the most one that tackles our intuitions about it, because surely we have to be able to say that it's wrong, right? And it is. It's in our self-interest that it's wrong. Of course it is. I just don't know how to get this across any better. I mean, they might think they're right, and if they happen to be right because the incentives of other people's self-interests aren't lined out well enough that it doesn't stop them from being able to do it, then that's people not acting well enough in their own self-interest as a society. And all these things like the institution of law, all these possible things have all come about and are all to the benefit of the individual self-interest, right? I mean, God, we argue about this for hours, literally hours. I don't know how to. I can't condense everything I say, but we did keep just going over the same points. So even if you, her position is that you need to be able to say something's right or wrong objectively. Which fine, but you can't. I'm not really sure there's such a thing. I know Sam kind of argues this a little bit, but given my stance on good and evil and how I reckon they're just constructs, like human constructs, cognitive constructs that have evolved, and I think so. It's kind of circular logic, really, because I reckon good and evil have evolved to describe the things which are in our self-interest and aren't in our self-interest, sort of, yes. So, things which were likely to, I've said how the fundamental characteristics of good things would be things like positive sum and symbiotic relationships and things like that. So if we were to get a peephole into a universe which has no consciousness, no conscious beings within it, there would literally be no good and evil in it until we were observing it, right? We'd be collapsing the wave function of good and evil, and we ascribe meaning to the actions or to the things that occurred in that universe. So if we saw like some planet that was on its way to harbouring life, and then suddenly its star went into supernova and destroyed it or something like that, we'd probably say that was not good. Probably not evil, but certainly not good, right? But without us there to do that, it's not either way. It's just what it is. Anyway, and then the circular logic comes in, because then we use good and evil. So any moral theory you come up with is going to be contingent upon your definitions of good and evil, which I argue have evolved. And I think that the way they've come to evolve to be that is kind of egoistically, founded. So it's gonna support itself. Anyway, I kind of lost my train of thought. So whatever moral theory you come up with, it's always going to, even if it actually had a God, okay, and I've talked about this before, even if it actually had a God that gave you strict mandates and edicts and tenets and all those things about what to do and what you're not allowed to do, right? You'd only adhere to it in as much as you believed it was going to be in your self-interest or not, or in as much as you believed, well, yes, that. So if it wasn't in accordance with your own morals, what you believed, you wouldn't follow it, right? Unless you were so convinced that you would suffer if you went against the grain. Oh God. Whatever. There's no. You can't really have objective. You can have kind of collective subjective, I think, is what you get, and the collective subjective kind of turns itself into objective because it tends towards objective. Because more like you're just trying to increase the probability that you're going to be acting in your self-interest, right? So you start to notice patterns, right? It's pattern recognition of things which are more likely to lead to a life that has a better area under the curve of having a life worth living, right? And things like, in the case of the paedophile, right, or Hitler, for that case, you just have to ask yourself, really, do you think you're more likely to maximise the area under your curve, or get closer to maximising the area under your curve, by following, by using Jesus as a role model, or by using Hitler as a role model? I think you'd have a fairly high degree of certainty that behaving like Jesus was more likely to work out in your favour than behaving like Hitler, right? I don't know. this is why I have to write them down, because I can't. They all just go on at once, and I can't focus on one of them and make the point. And as soon as I start making one, I'm thinking about the next, and I want to make that one instead. And anyway, stupid brain. All right, I'm going to try and do that thing in a bit. So we'll see how that goes.